This series begins by showing a man named Bryan Mills who is riding a train. At that time, Bryan is not alone, but with his beloved younger sister, Callie. It is revealed that Bryan is a former Special Forces soldier with above-average abilities, having received numerous awards during his time in service. Despite this, Bryan chose to retire early at his sister's request, as she no longer wanted to see him constantly in the midst of war. Initially, everything seems fine, with Bryan and Callie looking very happy because they are heading to the countryside for a vacation. However, things take a turn when some suspicious people enter their train car. Bryan, sensing something is wrong, quickly asks Callie to move to the next car while he keeps an eye on the suspicious individuals. As Callie is about to switch cars, a shooting suddenly erupts. Although Bryan manages to eliminate the suspicious people, sadly, Callie is shot and killed by the mysterious individual. At that moment, Bryan can only cry his heart out as he sees Callie lifeless, and he becomes convinced that those people were acting under someone's orders. Upon returning home, Bryan is swarmed by reporters asking about what happened. However, Bryan chooses to remain silent and immediately embraces his mother. At that moment, Bryan can only apologize to his mother for failing to protect his own sister. The scene shifts to the American intelligence office, showing the head of intelligence, Christina. At this point, Christina and her team are discussing Bryan, who is one of the best former Special Forces soldiers. It turns out that Christina is very eager to recruit him to her team, but the timing isn't right because Bryan is grieving. In the end, Christina instructs her subordinates to tap his phone so they can track wherever he goes. The next day, Bryan and his family are seen mourning Callie's death. While everyone is busy praying, one of Christina's subordinates sneaks into Bryan's room. The person quickly taps his phone and then leaves. Thanks to this device, Christina is able to track Bryan's movements and even listen to everything he says. Unfortunately, Bryan remains unaware of this as, after the mourning ceremony, he is approached by Callie's best friend, Asha, who is deeply saddened by her passing, having considered her like a sister. In the end, Bryan tries to stay strong by telling Asha that all they can do now is pray for the late Callie. In the late afternoon, Bryan asked his father for permission to calm himself for a while at their second house. Initially, his father refused, fearing that Bryan might hunt down those responsible for Callie's death. However, Bryan reassured him that he had already taken care of all the perpetrators on the train, so he would not become violent again. In the end, his father allowed Bryan to go. At the same time, all of this conversation was overheard by Christina and her subordinates because they had tapped Bryan's phone. Because of this, Christina immediately ordered two of her subordinates to follow Bryan wherever he went. Upon arriving at the second house, Bryan could only sit in silence, reminiscing about the happy times he shared with Callie. As a result, Bryan became very frustrated, as he had no idea where else to search for the mastermind behind her death. Later that night, Christina's two subordinates arrived at the parking lot of Bryan's second house. They simply observed him from a distance, as per Christina's orders. Not long after, while Bryan was drinking coffee, a car pulled up, and the people inside immediately infiltrated the house. Seeing this, Christina's two subordinates allowed them to enter, confident that Bryan could handle it. Apparently, Bryan had already noticed the intruders via CCTV and quickly prepared weapons to greet them. When the mysterious individuals were about to break down the door, Bryan attacked first. During the fight, 3 people managed to escape, but luckily, Bryan was able to capture one of them. Bryan immediately interrogated the captive about who had sent them, but unfortunately, the person died from a gunshot wound before answering. With no other option, Bryan took the phone from the person's jacket pocket and left. A few hours later, Bryan checked into a motel to rest. At that moment, he treated his wounds, as he had been hit during the attack. After that, Bryan contacted an old friend, Casper, who was also a comrade before his retirement. Bryan explained that he had just been attacked by a group of unknown people. Despite this, he was convinced that these individuals were connected to those who killed Callie. Therefore, Bryan asked Casper for help in finding out who the mastermind was and what these mysterious people wanted. Hearing this, Casper agreed and promised to gather information as quickly as possible. At dawn, Bryan was awakened by a message notification on his phone. When he checked, it wasn't his phone that had received the message, but the phone he had taken from the attacker. Bryan was shocked to discover that the message was from Casper. In the message, Casper asked the attacker whether he had successfully killed Bryan, revealing that he was part of the group. Realizing this, Bryan immediately prepared to confront him. As the sun began to rise, Casper was seen about to get into his car. Suddenly, Bryan appeared, pointing a gun at him. At that moment, Bryan couldn't believe that Casper would betray him like this. However, Casper swore that he had been forced into it because his daughter was being threatened. Bryan then asked who had ordered Casper, to which he replied that it was Carlos Magia, the biggest cartel boss in Colombia. It turned out that Carlos was someone who had been captured by Bryan in the past, during which he also killed Carlos's son, causing Carlos to hold a deep grudge against him. Hearing this, Bryan quickly forced Casper to take him to Carlos's headquarters right away. Sometime later, Bryan and Casper arrived at an underground station to head toward Carlos's headquarters. At that point, Casper mentioned that several of Carlos's men were following them, but Bryan didn't care and continued onward. Not long after, Bryan suddenly stopped and asked if Casper had ever met Callie. Casper replied yes, and from what he knew, she was very beautiful and kind. Pointing his gun, Bryan asked again why Casper had been so heartless as to take away the person he loved the most. Resigned to his fate, Casper said that if Bryan wanted to kill him, he was ready, but after his death, he begged Bryan to protect and raise his daughter. Hearing this, Bryan couldn't bring himself to do it and told Casper to leave and never show his face again. Before leaving, Casper warned Bryan to be careful, as Carlos's men were already close by. Bryan then continued his journey and encountered Carlos's men at the underground station. Unfortunately, Bryan ran out of bullets and eventually surrendered to them. As they were taking him to the car, Carlos's men threw his phone away, causing Christina to lose track of Bryan. Luckily, two of Christina's agents who were assigned to follow Bryan managed to capture Casper and interrogated him. Casper then revealed that Bryan had likely been taken to Carlos's headquarters and told them its location. When Bryan regained consciousness, he found himself held captive at Carlos's headquarters. Shortly after, Carlos appeared, stating that a life must be paid with a life. Bryan immediately explained that Carlos's son had died because he had pointed a weapon at a DA agent and questioned why he had killed Callie, who was innocent, calling it utterly unjust. In response, Carlos said that after Bryan died, he would also slaughter his entire family, and only then would his vengeance be satisfied. Carlos then took a knife, preparing to kill Bryan, but suddenly, the intelligence team and Christina's agents launched an attack to rescue Bryan. After a lengthy battle, the intelligence team was able to take down all of Carlos's men. Unfortunately, Carlos managed to hold Bryan at gunpoint, demanding that the team retreat. However, being no ordinary person, Bryan launched a counterattack. The intelligence team even asked him not to kill Carlos because they needed him alive. However, Bryan was determined to end him, forcing the team to knock him unconscious. The next day, Bryan woke up in a hospital, followed by Christina, who arrived and introduced herself. Christina then explained that she was the head of intelligence and had long wanted Bryan to join her team, but at that time, he was still in the military. Before answering her offer, Bryan asked where Carlos was, as he still wanted to kill him. Christina then told him that Carlos was being held in an intelligence prison and wouldn't be able to escape. However, she advised Bryan not to kill Carlos, as they still needed him for information about other cartels. Christina promised that if Bryan joined her, he would have access to monitor Carlos anytime he wanted. She also offered full protection for his family and a large salary, much better than being unemployed as he currently was. In the end, Bryan accepted Christina's offer and officially joined the intelligence agency. A week later, Bryan and the intelligence team were on a silent operation to infiltrate a terrorist hideout. The team successfully entered and neutralized everyone inside. While inside, Bryan saw the terrorist leader holding a woman hostage. The woman looked so much like his sister Callie that it brought back memories of her death. As a result, Bryan mercilessly killed the terrorist leader. At that moment, another intelligence team arrived and immediately reminded Bryan that it was all just a training exercise. Bryan apologized, explaining that he was still haunted by Callie's death. Sometime later, at a luxury restaurant, a U.S. senator was having dinner with an official. Suddenly, the senator collapsed from his chair and died on the spot. 2 hours later, Bryan is seen being lectured by Christina, urging him to let go of Callie's death so he could focus on the mission. She also warned that if Bryan continued in this state, his life would be ruined. At that moment, Bryan could only apologize and promise to move on. At the same time, Christina's assistant entered to inform them that the senator had just died. There was a rumor that the senator had died of a heart attack, but they were still assigned to investigate the case. Because of this, Christina asked Bryan and her assistant to rest, as they would begin investigating the senator's death the next morning. The following day, Christina was seated at her desk when she suddenly received a message from the senator's aide, requesting her to meet him. The aide claimed that the senator hadn't died of a heart attack, but was murdered. The aide also provided a meeting location, prompting Christina to quickly bring Bryan along to the rendezvous point. On the way, Bryan asked where their other colleagues were, and Christina replied that they had all been sent to Ukraine for another mission. Not long after, Christina arrived at the meeting location with the aide. At the same time, Bryan was positioned at a distance, serving as a sniper, while Christina's assistant and one of her team members were on standby with a car, monitoring the surroundings. When they met, the aide informed Christina that the senator didn't die from a heart attack, but was poisoned by someone. The aide also revealed that he was being chased by the people who killed the senator. Therefore, he urged Christina to get into his car as the pursuers were closing in. The aide quickly drove off with Christina, while Bryan and the others continued to monitor the situation. Just as the aide was about to reveal everything, he was suddenly shot and killed. As a result, the car crashed, leaving Christina severely injured. Bryan immediately pursued the shooter, but the person managed to escape on a motorcycle. However, Bryan was able to capture a photo of the shooter's face using his advanced sniper rifle. At the same time, Christina's assistant and team member arrived to check on her condition. They quickly transported the critically injured Christina to the nearest hospital. Once they arrived, doctors immediately attended to her, while Bryan and the others returned to headquarters. The next day, the intelligence team that had been deployed to Ukraine returned to the base and began investigating the senator's case. One of the team members, John, expressed disbelief, wondering how Bryan managed to capture a photo of the shooter fleeing on a motorcycle. However, Bryan simply replied that it was pure luck. Using their advanced technology, the intelligence team was able to identify the shooter from Bryan's photo. The shooter turned out to be William Davis, a former soldier who had become a mercenary and was now living in California. The investigation revealed that William was their only lead, and it was crucial to capture him alive. Additionally, since Christina was still in the hospital, John took charge of the mission. Therefore, he immediately ordered the team, including Bryan, to prepare for the operation to capture William that very day. When they arrived at William's residence, John instructed Bryan to stay in the car, fearing that the memory of Callie's death might cause him to jeopardize the mission. After that, John and the rest of the team then moved in to raid the house. During the raid, William managed to escape to the roof, while John and the others lost track of him. Bryan, who was waiting in the car, happened to spot William and immediately gave chase, following him to the roof. Although Bryan didn't intend to kill him, the struggle between them led to William accidentally falling to the lower floor. Fortunately, William survived, and the intelligence team rushed him to the hospital, where the medical team took over while Bryan and the others waited outside. Not long after, Bryan noticed from the hospital's CCTV footage that 4 suspicious individuals had arrived. Bryan then quickly contacted John and informed him that a group was approaching, with 2 heading for the elevator and the other 2 taking the stairs. Bryan was certain that they were there to kill William to prevent him from talking. Bryan immediately took action by entering William's room and pretending to be him, as William had already been moved to another room. At the same time, John and the team pursued the 2 individuals heading for the stairs. Soon after, the 2 who had taken the elevator reached William's room, disguised as nurses. Before they could kill him, they apologized, explaining that his position had become too dangerous. Suddenly, Bryan attacked them, killing one and subduing the other. The next day, Bryan and John were seen interrogating the person they had captured the previous day. Christina, who had recovered from the previous accident, was also there, and she immediately asked who was behind the senator's death. At first, The person claimed not to know, stating that his only orders were to kill William. However, after Bryan threatened to inject him with poison that would cause him to die in extreme pain, the person finally confessed that the mastermind behind the senator's death was the official who had been with the senator at the time and was also the senator's close friend. Unexpectedly, the reason the official killed the senator was because his corruption had been exposed. Upon hearing this, Christina and the team immediately went to find the official. The next night, the official was seen relaxing at his usual restaurant when suddenly Christina and Bryan arrived, informing him that they knew everything about who was behind the senator's death. However, they added that they wouldn't kill the official because that was a matter for the law. Upon hearing this, the official suffered a heart attack and died on the spot, leaving Christina and Bryan momentarily speechless as their mission had now come to an end. Since joining the intelligence team, Bryan had been able to afford a house not far from headquarters. Despite this, he now lived alone, as his parents had refused to move with him. Soon after, Asha visited Bryan's house, expressing her concern since he hadn't been seen since the incident involving Callie. Bryan then explained that he had joined an intelligence team, which made it difficult for him to return to his hometown often. He also mentioned that his team had successfully captured his sister's killer, Carlos. While they were deep in conversation, Bryan suddenly received a call from Christina, asking him to come to headquarters immediately because a terrorist was threatening to detonate a bomb in the city center. Before leaving, Bryan told Asha to stay inside his house, as there was a terrorist threat outside. Additionally, he asked Asha to wait for his return and not to leave under any circumstances. Shortly after, Bryan arrived at headquarters, where Christina immediately briefed the entire team. She explained that the terrorist's name was Ismet, an Iraqi national. However, since 2011, Ismet had been living in the U.S. with his wife and children. Ismet now resided in a neighborhood primarily inhabited by Iraqi immigrants. Therefore, to gather more information, Christina suggested they visit Ismet's home to speak with his wife. Upon arriving at Ismet's home, only Christina and Bryan entered, while John and the others were stationed nearby to monitor from a distance. Inside, Ismet's wife warmly welcomed them, which prompted Christina to immediately ask if she knew that Ismet had become a terrorist threatening to detonate a bomb in the city, endangering many lives. Ismet's wife replied that her husband was a deeply religious man, and she was certain someone had coerced him into this. She also mentioned that Ismet had been missing for several days, and the last time she saw him, he had been playing soccer in the backyard before suddenly disappearing. Not long after, Ismet's son suddenly ran to the backyard, prompting Bryan to chase after him. At that moment, Ismet's son seemed to be hiding something, so Bryan kept pursuing him. The chase continued until they reached a building filled with Iraqi immigrants. Ismet's son handed a phone to someone there, asking them for protection. Inside the building, Bryan tried to explain that he wasn't a bad person and just wanted to help, but the people there attacked him, leading to a fight. However, it didn't take long for him to defeat them and seize the phone. Afterward, Bryan reassured Ismet's son to stay calm as he was there to help, but the boy ran off again. An hour later, Bryan and his team returned to headquarters, where they immediately examined the contents of Ismet's son's phone. It turned out to contain a video of Ismet's son playing soccer in the backyard. In the distance, they saw Ismet being abducted and forced into a car. Fortunately, the video showed a barcode on the car window, which Christina's team was able to trace. Upon tracing it, they discovered the car belonged to a former special agent named Tom. As a result, Christina immediately ordered her team to apprehend Tom as soon as possible. Later that afternoon, Tom was seen visiting a friend's grave. After paying his respects, he headed to his car to go home, but suddenly, Tom lost consciousness. When Tom finally regains consciousness, he found himself in the intelligence agency's headquarters, facing Bryan for interrogation. Bryan then asked where Ismet was, knowing that Tom had abducted him. Bryan also questioned why they were making Ismet seem like a terrorist about to detonate a bomb in the city center. Initially, Tom refused to talk, but after being threatened with the death of his entire family, he revealed everything. Tom confessed that the person who ordered him was the Minister of Defense, who had instructed him to kidnap Ismet and force him to become a terrorist set to bomb the city center. This was all part of a plan to provoke the U.S. into attacking Iraq, allowing the minister to embezzle massive war funds. Unexpectedly, Ismet had already been strapped with a bomb vest with a high explosive yield. At that moment, Ismet was inside the restroom of a cafe located in the heart of the capital, and the bomb was set to detonate within an hour. Hearing this, Christina immediately assigned Bryan, John, and the others to rescue Ismet, while she would gather more information about the Minister of Defense. Shortly after, the intelligence team arrived at the cafe in question. Therefore, Bryan headed straight to the restroom to find Ismet, while John and the others secured all the patrons. Upon finding Ismet, Bryan told him to stay calm, as he was there to help. Bryan then took Ismet to a secluded place while searching for a way to disarm the bomb vest. After inspecting it, Bryan realized the bomb was set to be detonated remotely via a cell phone, meaning that if there was no signal, the bomb would automatically deactivate. Bryan quickly took Ismet to a location guaranteed to have no signal. Unfortunately, despite running a long distance, there was still a signal, and there were only 40 seconds left. By chance, Bryan found a well and immediately brought Ismet inside it. Luckily, the bomb didn't explode, as the signal couldn't reach them inside the well. As a result, Bryan's mission to save Ismet was successful, and the next step was to go after the Minister of Defense. The next day, Christina invited Bryan to capture the minister, planning to meet him in a park while Bryan would act as a sniper from a distance. Bryan asked if the minister wasn't aware they were hunting him. Christina explained that they were a secret intelligence agency, so no one knew about their missions except the president. That afternoon, Christina sat alone in the park, waiting for the minister, while Bryan was ready with his sniper, awaiting her signal. Soon, the minister arrived, and they started talking. Mid-conversation, Christina directly confronted him about the main issue, asking why he was willing to scapegoat Iraqi immigrants for his own greed. Christina added that if the bomb had detonated, countless American citizens would have been killed. Hearing this, the minister was shocked and reached for his weapon, but he was suddenly shot dead. Bryan and Christina quickly left the scene. That night, Bryan finally returned home, where he was greeted by Asha, who had been worried since he hadn't contacted her. Bryan apologized, explaining that his mission had kept him very busy, but now everything was over, so Asha no longer had to worry. Asha then said her goodbyes, as the city was now safe again. A few days later, Christina's assistant received a call from a man named Ramsey, a former FBI agent who knew Christina well. At that moment, Ramsey asked for help from the intelligence team because his daughter had been kidnapped by America's biggest mafia boss, Ward. The mafia boss had kidnapped his daughter because Ramsey possessed incriminating evidence on Ward that could land him in prison. However, Christina's assistant suggested Ramsey come to their headquarters the next day, as she was currently out. The next day, Ramsey was seen at headquarters, speaking with Christina. At that moment, Ramsey pleaded with Christina to have her intelligence team rescue his daughter, who had been kidnapped by Ward. Initially, Christina refused the request, explaining that it was a personal matter and the intelligence team only handled major cases with direct approval from the president. Hearing this, Ramsey responded by revealing that he possessed important data on Ward, which implicated many high-ranking officials. If Christina agreed to help save his daughter, Ramsey promised to hand over the data, allowing the intelligence team to expose which officials had been collaborating with Ward. Finally, Christina agreed to Ramsey's request. 1 hour later, Christina began assembling the team for a new mission to rescue Ramsey's daughter from Ward. During the rescue, they would use a COD strategy, where Ramsey would pretend to exchange Ward's criminal data for his daughter. Once his daughter was safe, the intelligence team would eliminate Ward's men and reclaim the data. After all team members understood the plan, Christina instructed Ramsey to contact Ward to propose the exchange. When connected, Ramsey pretended to beg for mercy, promising to hand over the data as long as his daughter was released. Eventually, Ward instructed Ramsey to come to an amusement park where they would exchange the criminal data for his daughter. Upon hearing this, Bryan and the team immediately prepared to head to the location with Ramsey. Once there, Bryan instructed Ramsey to approach first, carrying the laptop containing the criminal data, while Bryan and the others would follow silently. Ramsey then walked alone into the amusement park, carrying the laptop that held the mafia boss's criminal data. Soon, Ward's men appeared, spreading out cautiously as they feared it might be a trap. At the same time, Ramsey's daughter was also present but was suddenly attacked by one of Ward's men and recaptured when they spotted Bryan and the team. Acting quickly, Bryan chased after the group while John and the others secured Ramsey in the car. After a lengthy pursuit, Bryan managed to shoot one of the men who had taken Ramsey's daughter, but she ran away, thinking Bryan was also a bad guy. As a result, she was recaptured by Ward's men and taken away again. Bryan then took the phone from the man he had shot and hid the man's body in a trash bin. At headquarters, Christina's assistant immediately examined the phone that Bryan had brought. It turned out that the man Bryan had killed was Ward's younger brother, which made the situation even more complicated. Ramsey became increasingly frustrated because instead of succeeding, the intelligence mission had failed completely, putting his daughter at even greater risk. As a result, Bryan tried to calm Ramsey, assuring him that he would take responsibility, even if he had to do it alone. Soon after, Ward called the phone that Bryan had taken. In the call, Ward demanded that Bryan come alone with the laptop containing the criminal data. If Bryan brought any troops, Ward warned that Ramsey's daughter would not survive. Additionally, Ward sent the meeting location, and Bryan was instructed to arrive early the next morning. The next day, Bryan was already stationed at the meeting location. At that time, two men arrived and tried to force him into a car. However, Bryan managed to eliminate one of them and then forced the remaining man to take him to Ward's headquarters. Upon arrival, Bryan handcuffed the man inside the car before entering Ward's headquarters to eliminate everyone inside. At one point, Bryan found Ramsey's daughter and immediately freed her restraints. Just then, Ward suddenly appeared from behind, aiming a weapon at Bryan. Fortunately, Bryan managed to escape to the lower floor using an explosion he had set up earlier. Despite this, Ward survived and quickly pursued Bryan, who had taken Ramsey's daughter into a warehouse. Unexpectedly, Bryan sprinkled gasoline as a precaution in case Ward arrived. Soon enough, Ward arrived and stood right above the gasoline Bryan had spread. As a result, Bryan successfully rescued Ramsey's daughter and eliminated Ward without having to hand over the laptop containing the mafia boss's criminal data. Shortly afterward, John and the others arrived, and Ramsey was seen immediately hugging his daughter. Ramsey also did not forget to thank Bryan for saving his daughter. 2 days later, Bryan was working out in a busy place. At the same time, a group of people suddenly injected a lethal substance into one of the men there. Realizing this, Bryan quickly checked the man's condition, who was still barely alive, while the group managed to escape. Before dying, the man handed Bryan a safe deposit box key and asked him to open the safe with it. Bryan soon took the key to Christina's assistant, who discovered that the key was for a safe deposit box in a bank located not in America, but in Switzerland. Curious about the contents of the safe, Christina immediately assigned her team to go to Switzerland and retrieve the contents of the safe. However, since this mission was illegal, Christina instructed the team to carry out the mission covertly by any means necessary. Before leaving, Christina's assistant informed that the bank owner was a fat man named Samron. Therefore, to avoid endangering many people, it was suggested that they kidnap both Samron and his manager. If those two were successfully abducted, it would be much easier to access the safe deposit box room. Without delay, Bryan and his team set off for Switzerland to carry out the covert mission. Soon after, Bryan and his team arrived in Switzerland. At that time, Bryan divided the tasks. He and his female colleague would abduct Samron, the bank owner, while John and the others were tasked with kidnapping the bank manager. 2 hours later, John and his colleague arrived at the bank manager's house and successfully kidnapped him. At the same time, Bryan and his female colleague had also managed to confront Samron and forcibly take him. Afterward, Bryan informed John that he had successfully abducted Samron, so it was better for them to meet at the bank. Eventually, Bryan brought Samron to the bank, while John brought the bank manager. At that moment, Bryan and his female colleague forced Samron and the bank manager to lead them to the vault. Meanwhile, John and the others were stationed outside the bank to monitor the surroundings. Before entering the vault, the bank manager requested that Bryan and his colleague not bring any weapons, as the vault was equipped with sensitive weapon detection sensors. If the sensors were triggered, they would automatically alert the police, Consequently, Bryan and his colleague discarded their weapons. Once inside, Bryan asked Samron to open the vault they were searching for. However, Samron did not open that vault, but instead accessed his personal vault containing weapons. The situation was reversed, with Bryan and his colleague now being held captive by Samron and the bank manager. At that moment, Samron asked who Bryan really was and how they had managed to obtain a key to one of the vaults. Bryan tried to remain calm, saying he was merely following orders from someone. As a result, Samron opened the vault, which contained a memory card. While holding Bryan's colleague hostage, Samron inquired about the contents of the memory card. However, Bryan did not answer and instead launched an attack. Unexpectedly, John and the others were also ambushed by Samron's men, leading to a shootout. As a result, the security alarm blared loudly and immediately connected to the local police. Realizing this, Bryan quickly fled with the memory card he had obtained. As he was heading out, Bryan saw John, who had fought off Samron's men but had been shot in the process, leaving him incapacitated. Bryan and the others swiftly took John to the nearest hospital. The next day, Bryan and his team were at the airport, preparing to return to America. John, who had received medical treatment, was also there, and together they left Switzerland. During the flight, Bryan reviewed the memory card he had taken from the bank vault, discovering that it contained a video confession from the man who had given him the vault key. The video revealed that the man was an assistant to the Chief Justice in America, who had been accepting bribes from anyone seeking to avoid legal consequences. It turned out the man had tried several times to stop the Chief Justice, but the judge had sent people to eliminate him. Fortunately, the man had made a confession video and stored it in the Swiss vault. Because of this, Bryan was furious and vowed to pursue the Chief Justice immediately. However, his female colleague advised him not to act impulsively, as they had a superior, Christina. Upon arriving in America, Bryan met with Christina and handed over the memory card, asking her to watch the confession video. He then requested permission to pursue the Chief Justice. However, Christina advised Bryan not to be hasty, as the evidence was only a confession video from one person. Additionally, they needed to find detailed evidence of the Chief Justice's misconduct before they could proceed with pursuing him. Eventually, Bryan agreed to Christina's instructions. The next day, Christina was seen discussing the Chief Justice's crimes with the CIA chief, providing the confession video as evidence. As a result, the CIA chief promised to handle the situation. 2 days later, Bryan was having dinner with Asha. It seemed they had feelings for each other, and Bryan declared his love for Asha. At the same time, the news on TV reported that the Chief Justice had been arrested by the CIA chief, as evidence of his crimes had been uncovered. Bryan was pleased to hear this news, as it meant he no longer had to hunt the judge. Therefore, he invited Asha to stay at his house, marking the beginning of their official relationship. In the following days, Bryan and his intelligence team continued to undertake dangerous missions. They were now tasked with pursuing a Russian colonel who had killed 2 American CIA agents. However, Bryan and his team were confident they could handle the mission. On the other hand, John, who had been injured in the previous mission, was on a week-long leave. As a result, he spent his time exercising with the children around his home. After completing the mission in Russia, Bryan had returned home and was seen enjoying intimate moments with Asha. They were living together like a married couple, and Bryan promised that he would soon marry Asha, which made her very happy. The next day, Bryan and his team were assigned by Christina to capture the largest illegal arms dealer, Vergaz, who was also supplying weapons to Carlos. Once everything was ready, Bryan and his team set out to capture the arms dealer. At that time, John, who had fully recovered, rejoined the team. Unfortunately, during the mission, Bryan was captured and tortured by Vergaz men. However, amidst the torture, Bryan managed to turn the situation around when John and the others arrived to help him. In the end, Bryan managed to escape and capture Vergaz. 4 days later, Bryan, John, and the others were assigned to pick up a woman named Elena at the airport, who was a spy returning from a mission. During the journey, Bryan asked why her return required an intelligence escort. Elena then explained that she had been spying on terrorists in Iran and had been discovered. Despite this, Elena managed to escape and return to America. Therefore, Elena requested protection from the intelligence team, as she believed the Iranian terrorists would pursue her to America. Soon after, Bryan successfully brought Elena to the intelligence headquarters. Christina then instructed Elena not to go anywhere and to stay there. Additionally, Christina promised that her team would protect Elena until the situation was completely safe. One night, Elena requested permission from Christina to visit the Iranian ambassador's office, as she needed to discuss some important matters with the ambassador. With no other option, Christina allowed Elena to go, provided that Bryan accompanied her. Thus, the two of them set off. Upon arrival, the Iranian ambassador, Saddam, warmly welcomed Elena and Bryan. However, Elena suddenly revealed that she knew Saddam had been collaborating with terrorists. Upon hearing this, Saddam remained silent, and his men immediately attacked her. Fortunately, Bryan managed to eliminate all of Saddam's men present, although Saddam himself managed to escape. Soon after, Christina arrived to help Bryan, and they pursued Saddam's men who were fleeing to the parking lot. During this time, Elena attempted to approach a car to search for Saddam's men, but the car suddenly exploded, causing her to perish. The next day, Christina gathered the entire team at headquarters, deeply disappointed with herself for failing to protect Elena. Despite this, Bryan reassured her that they were not at fault, as Elena died due to her own recklessness. Nonetheless, Christina explained that their mission was considered a failure because Saddam had escaped. 1 week later, Christina and the entire team were gathered together. Christina explained that they had a new mission: to transfer Carlos to a federal prison. Of course, Bryan objected, as transferring Carlos would make it easier for him to escape. Despite this, Christina could not do anything about it because it was a direct order from the intelligence higher-ups. In fact, the transfer of Carlos would be handled by the FBI, not by them. As a result, Bryan and his team could only remain silent. Upon returning home, Bryan told Asha that Carlos, the cartel leader who had eliminated Cali, would be transferred to a federal prison. Bryan was very disappointed with this decision because if Carlos was transferred, it would be easy for him to escape. In the end, Asha could only comfort Bryan. In a basement, a man was seen parking his car. However, as soon as the man got out of the car, he was suddenly kidnapped by a group of people. On the other hand, the FBI director, Teresa, received a call from her husband before leaving for her office. However, during the call, her husband suddenly asked for help because he had been kidnapped. It was revealed that the man who was kidnapped in the basement was her husband. From the call, the kidnapper stated that if Teresa wanted to see her husband alive, she had to hand over the prisoner named Carlos Maggia to them. It was revealed that Carlos's men had found out that their boss would be transferred to a federal prison by the FBI. Therefore, they quickly kidnapped Teresa's husband because she would be leading the transfer mission of Carlos. Hearing this, Teresa pleaded with them not to hurt her husband because she loved him very much. Elsewhere, Bryan was seen placing a tracking device on the prison jumpsuit that would be worn by Carlos. In short, Bryan delivered the jumpsuit to Carlos. Despite this, Bryan told Carlos not to get too pleased because whatever plans he had, Bryan would continue to hunt him. In response, Carlos said that he would also keep hunting Bryan as long as he lived because he had eliminated his son. Once again, Bryan explained that at that time, Carlos's son had threatened a DEA agent, which forced Bryan to eliminate him. This was different from Carlos eliminating Cali without any remorse or resistance. Nevertheless, Carlos just smiled and said that he only needed to wait to see what would happen next. 1 hour before Carlos was to be transferred, Teresa approached Bryan. She explained that her husband had been kidnapped by Carlos's men, and she was forced to bring the cartel boss to the airstrip for his transfer to the federal prison. If Teresa did not comply with their demands, her husband would not survive. Therefore, Teresa was confused about what to do and hoped that Bryan could help. Upon hearing this, Bryan told Teresa to stay calm because he would do his best to help her. Quickly, Bryan and his team informed Christina via video call. After learning everything, Christina assigned her team to carry out the mission. At the same time, Bryan and 2 of his teammates were assigned to locate where Teresa's husband had been kidnapped and rescue him. Meanwhile, John and others were tasked with escorting Carlos along with Teresa and ensuring that the cartel boss did not escape. After that, they all swiftly prepared to carry out their tasks. In short, Carlos was now placed in a vehicle for transfer to the federal prison, where John and others were there to guard him. At the same time, Bryan and his two teammates, assisted by Christina's aide, were trying to find out where Teresa's husband was held. As time passed with no news from Bryan, Teresa decided to take Carlos to the airstrip. Teresa intended to hand over Carlos to his men rather than risk her husband becoming a victim. At that moment, John tried to calm Teresa by saying that Bryan would soon succeed. However, Teresa remained stubborn and took Carlos out of the vehicle. Soon after, a helicopter controlled by Carlos's men arrived. On the other hand, Bryan and his team had just arrived at the location where Teresa's husband was kidnapped. They quickly acted by eliminating the people there, and at one point Bryan managed to find Teresa's husband, who was being threatened by an enemy. Calmly, Bryan managed to rescue Teresa's husband before immediately contacted John to inform him that Teresa's husband was safe with him. Meanwhile, Teresa was preparing to hand Carlos over to his men. Fortunately, John shouted, and they were able to eliminate all of Carlos's men. However, Carlos had managed to escape to an unknown location. Because of this, John quickly notified Bryan about Carlos's escape. Bryan swiftly opened his phone to check Carlos's current location since he had previously installed a GPS tracker on Carlos's prison jumpsuit. The scene then shifted to Asha, who suddenly received a package at her home. Asha was confused because she had not ordered the package. However, she was ambushed by the courier, who turned out to be one of Carlos's men and managed to abduct her. Elsewhere, Carlos was seen trying to escape by car, but Bryan suddenly arrived and immediately confronted him. Bryan quickly handcuffed Carlos and intended to take him back to the intelligence prison. However, during the journey, Bryan received a call from Asha, who was screaming for help because she had been kidnapped. Additionally, the kidnapper demanded that Bryan release Carlos if he wanted Asha to live. Filled with rage, Bryan unlocked Carlos's handcuffs and assaulted him. Bryan also pointed a gun at him and demanded that he release Asha immediately. Carlos then allowed Bryan to kill him if he wished, but warned that Asha would also die. With no other choice, Bryan reluctantly released Carlos and let him go. An hour after Carlos escaped, therefore Bryan hitched a ride with a woman's car to Texas. Upon arrival, Bryan was contacted by Asha, who was now with Carlos. Through the phone, Carlos stated that he would soon take Asha to Mexico, where their game was just beginning. At that moment, Bryan immediately responded that he would come to deal with Carlos, no matter how many men he had, as no one would stop him. Not long after, Bryan went to a barber shop on the American-Mexican border, as Carlos's last GPS location was there. Bryan immediately threatened the two barbers, asking where Carlos had gone and if they were his men. The barbers swore that they were not Carlos's men, but that the cartel boss frequented the shop because it was his regular place. They also informed Bryan that Carlos had used an underground tunnel in the warehouse at the end of the street to go to Mexico. Without delay, Bryan headed there. However, just a few steps away, Bryan encountered Christina and her team. At that moment, Christina explained that they needed to go back because the mission to capture Carlos had been fully handed over to the FBI. If Bryan continued to pursue the cartel boss, the intelligence agency would face penalties as it was no longer their jurisdiction. Bryan responded that Carlos had killed his sister and now had kidnapped Asha, his loved one. Therefore, he would track Carlos wherever he went because Carlos had taken the people Bryan cared about. Christina understood but pleaded with Bryan to return, assuring him that the FBI would act swiftly. Finally, Bryan agreed to her order. However, midway through, Bryan suddenly escaped from Christina and her team. On the other hand, Carlos and his assistant had just arrived at the warehouse at the end of the street to head to Mexico through the underground tunnel. Asha was also there, forced to comply with all of Carlos's orders. Additionally, Carlos was very pleased, as once he set foot in Mexico, he would become a king. All the police, military, and other law enforcers would bow to Carlos because he was the biggest cartel there. Carlos then entered and immediately opened the underground door leading to Mexico. At the same time, Bryan was outside and fired his weapon at the warehouse door. Realizing this, Carlos quickly left with his assistant, taking Asha with them. Not standing idle, Bryan immediately pursued Carlos into the tunnel, leading to a chase. At that moment, Carlos instructed his assistant to intercept Bryan while he continued forward with Asha, as Mexico was only a few steps away. However, Bryan eventually managed to eliminate the assistant, even though the tunnel was collapsing. Soon after, John and the rest of the team arrived and quickly helped Bryan, who had been trapped under debris. John then persuaded Bryan to return to headquarters, but he responded that if the intelligence agency was not allowed to capture Carlos, he would leave the agency immediately. As a result, Bryan allowed John and the others to go home since he was no longer part of the intelligence agency and was free to do whatever he wanted. However, not wanting to lose Bryan, John and the others decided to stay and assist him. In short, Bryan and his team reached the end of the tunnel, entering Mexican territory. Carlos was there with Asha and was warmly received by the military, who would escort him home. Seeing this, Bryan was eager to go out and take them all down, but John suggested that they should consider another approach as it was not the right time to attack. As a result, Bryan agreed to John's advice. Shortly after, John contacted Christina and informed her that Bryan would leave the agency if forced to return. Furthermore, John and the others had agreed to help Bryan because they couldn't lose him, who had become like family. Reluctant to lose her team, Christina granted permission but insisted they operate covertly due to the mission's illegal nature. Not long after, John and the others began strategizing for the hunt to capture Carlos at his home and rescue Asha. An hour later, Carlos had arrived at his home with Asha. They were hosting a grand celebration to mark Carlos's return. Unexpectedly, Bryan and the others secretly infiltrated the premises, taking out the guards one by one silently. Afterward, Bryan split the team, with himself and John going inside, while the rest secured the area outside. Unbeknownst to them, Christina was also near Carlos's house. She had requested assistance from her team at headquarters to contact the Mexican military general as she needed help. Additionally, Christina knew that lower-ranking military and police officers were likely collaborating with Carlos, so she planned to seek direct assistance from the general. The scene shifts back to Bryan and John, who are now inside Carlos's house. At that moment, Carlos is about to have dinner with his business associates, but he is contacted by his men who have discovered several bodies, indicating that they must have intruders. Consequently, Carlos quickly orders all his forces to check every room. Unexpectedly, Bryan, John, and the entire team begin their operations, leading to a shootout amid the chaos. After that, Bryan continues to search for Asha to rescue her. Outside, the Mexican military, which Christina had requested for assistance, starts approaching Carlos's house. Soon after, Bryan finds Asha, who is being held hostage by Carlos with a knife. At that moment, Carlos threatens to kill Asha if he doesn't put down his weapon. Reluctantly, Bryan complies, but Carlos still injures Asha before leaving. As a result, Asha suffers severe neck wounds, and Bryan immediately asks John and the others to take her to the nearest hospital. Not long after, Carlos has escaped, but is surrounded by the Mexican military. Christina is also present, which prevents the military personnel from letting Carlos go. At the same time, Bryan arrives and immediately confronts him. Seeing this, Christina reminds Bryan not to kill Carlos because this is not their jurisdiction and they lack the necessary authorization. However, Bryan ignores her and he ends up killing Carlos, though he is also shot by the Mexican military. Christina tries to negotiate with the military, hoping to bring Bryan back, but they refuse because Bryan must be punished for breaking the rules. 4 days later, Christina is seen meeting with her team, where John inquires about Bryan's fate. Christina apologizes, explaining that she did everything she could to free Bryan, but was unsuccessful. She even sought help from the Mexican ambassador, who was unable to assist. The only remaining option was to forcibly extract Bryan, but that would carry significant risks. The scene shifts to Asha, who is now recovering in the hospital. Despite her severe injuries, she has undergone surgery and is in the recovery phase. Meanwhile, Bryan is shown to be imprisoned in Mexico under very dire conditions. The story ends here. Moral lesson from the story: never kidnap a fat banker and his manager, because they might end up turning the tables on you. And remember, if you chase criminals into a collapsing tunnel, at least bring a flashlight and a good escape plan.